Let's start with today's discussion about the continued violence against journalists and workers at the hands of the Islamic State. As promised, the militant group released another video this past weekend claiming it had also now beheaded British aid worker Brian Haynes. At the same time that news was breaking, a series of stories, all claiming to be exclusive, with the parents of James Foley and Steve Sotloff. The theme of those stories was pretty much all the same: claims that the United States government did little to support the families during their son's time in captivity, and in some cases possibly threatened them with arrest if they met the ransom demands on their own. Here's Jim Foley's mother, Diane, with CNN's Anderson Cooper.
We were, asked to not go to the media, to just trust that it would be taken care of. We were told we could not raise ransom, that it was illegal, we might be prosecuted.
You were told you would actually be prosecuted?
Yes,
if you
that was a real possibility. Told that many times. We were told that our government would not exchange prisoners, would not do a military action. So we were just told to trust that he would be freed somehow, miraculously. And he wasn't, was he?
Your reactions to that clip?
Well, I mean, first of all, you have to feel deeply for these families. If you were in their shoes, you would feel exactly the same way. And from the stories that have been reported, there is some question, at least of the level of tact, at the very least, that was used in communicating with them, what kind of information the government was willing to share with them. On the other hand, I do have to say, and it is a legitimate story, but I have to say, we still come back to that question we've been talking about for a few weeks now. Is the U.S. and British policy about paying no ransoms for hostages a legitimate policy? And that still should be part of this conversation, too. I mean, you can make a case for it because the European governments that did get those individuals freed by paying ransoms have contributed to the financing of these terrorist organizations. And as our government at least argues, and you can make the argument, it can encourage more kidnappings if you're going to pay ransom. So I think that's an important question that we need to keep talking about. However, there is one issue that I think the families make this really is legitimate. I mean, not only did they discourage them from raising ransom and say it's illegal and it doesn't fit U.S. government policy, they also said there will be no prisoner exchanges. When we just did that with Bo Bergdahl, the sergeant who was released after how many 5 people from Guantanamo that we had were released from the Taliban people. So that was a change in U.S. policy that was okay for a soldier, but it's not okay for an American citizen.
And I think that's one of the things that at least the administration is saying that's the difference, is that we're talking about a soldier, and he was being treated as a prisoner of war in this circumstance, which was one of the rationales that they used for having the prisoner exchange. That wasn't necessarily the case when it came down to the journalists. So I think that I'm not saying that that's a legitimate argument to put out there, but at least that's what they're saying. And in terms of the policy that the British and the Americans have, that's a long-standing policy. And they've actually come out and said that over and over. When you look at the other nations involved, France, Italy, Switzerland, I think was another one that has paid the ransom. They're basically saying that we're going to do whatever we need to do in order to protect our citizens. But the problem with that is as you said, Mike, they're actually financing the operations of these terrorist organizations.
And the only thing when we talk about the government saying that Bergdahl was a prisoner of war, and so that's a difference. Well, in the war on terror are American citizens who are not soldiers, who are being used as hostages. Are they not also prisoners of war? A family other people could make that argument. It just bothers me. And the other thing that kind of bothers me a little bit, from the New York Times story at least, that got into great detail about how the family was treated. The European hostages, yes, their governments allowed or helped ransoms be paid, but they also intervened very directly in helping to scan and monitor the emails. And in some instances, according to the Times, the government took over the responses of the emails from the families to make sure that the right message was being portrayed. The American families were on their own, it sounds like, if you take their account.
That was one of the things that I did want to bring up, is that I think that the American government and maybe the British government could learn something from the way in which these other nations responded and still maintain their policy. Right. If you get involved early enough, then you can have a little bit more control, and also have a little bit more of an understanding of what the families are going through, because you're right, they felt like they were left out on their own to deal with this, and they were hamstrung by the policy that's set up by the American and British governments.
And just out of fairness, I think we should say, regardless of the criticisms of how the administration may have treated the families, the Obama administration did launch a rescue attempt. Many special operations forces went into harm's way to try to release not only the Americans, but everybody else. It just didn't work out.
So one of the other issues we've brought up as it related to this is that Sotloff and Foley both were freelance journalists, that they didn't necessarily have the power of a big name news organization supporting the work that they were there doing. Well, one of the New York Times's Iraq-based reporters was on CNN this weekend talking about how his situation covering the Islamic State is different.
Since you're home visiting your folks, have you talked to them about the security risks that you face?
Not yet. I just got here, and I'm sure it might come up around the dinner table in the next few days. But so far, I've tried to keep it light.
I mean, I hate to even try to talk about these issues, but if you were to be kidnapped, if you were to be detained, even briefly, by one of these opposition groups, what would you want your family to do? Would you want them to be speaking out in public? Would you want them to be keeping quiet the way Sotloff's family did? Have you thought about that before?
I haven't thought about that specific question, but I think it would probably be more in the hands of the New York Times than my family, and I would defer to the experts. I honestly don't know what is better, whether to keep it quiet or to go public.
So one of the things we were talking about right before we started today's show and before we went on was how does anybody go and tell a parent what to do in that situation when their child has been kidnapped? Equally difficult, how does a child prepare their parents in a situation like this and what we just saw there for the possibility it could happen?
Well, I would hope that the New York Times, being the international organization that it is, would have some protocols on how they're going to deal with the situation. And I'm pretty sure, or at least I would hope, that since he's back, would sit down with his family and say, here's the protocols that the New York Times are going to follow. Here's the people that they're going to be working with in government, if he's at liberty to talk about those things.
Which was kind of one of those things in the clip and in that interview that I saw, like all credit to Brian Stelter for asking the question, but if I'm Tim Marengo, I don't know that I'm going to actually answer it on national TV.
Well, and I have to say, from previous examples, major news organizations have tended to follow the be quiet, follow what the government is saying until such time as you can say something else. I wonder if one consequence of this story, showing how Sotloff's family and Foley's family were so displeased with the way they were treated, that other families, regardless of what the journalists may tell them, may have a different response in the future.
You're absolutely right, but I would want to think that when you're talking about a major news organization like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or someone like that, they would have had some sort of communication with the government. They would have some lines of communication going that's different from when you're a freelancer, right, and you're working for an organization that may not have the stature of, say, a New York Times, a Wall Street Journal, NBC News,
or if you're working on
like
spec and don't have anybody backing your work until after it's done.
Exactly.
But I mean, the Global Post, which was this online news organization that was supporting Foley, I mean, they were involved with the family. And according to that New York Times story, they were helping to try to raise money. So I don't know that the distinction is quite as bright as we might think it is.